When I was a little girl, my father was the center of my world. I remember looking up at him with pure admiration, believing he was the strongest and most dependable man I could ever know. He tucked me in at night, read my favorite stories with a gentle voice, and never missed a chance to cheer for me at school events. Those simple moments created a picture of love and safety in my heart, a bond one thought nothing could ever break. For me, he was not just my father, he was my hero, the one who made my childhood feel whole. But as I grew a little older, I started noticing changes. Whispers in the house, arguments muffled behind closed doors, and my mother's tired eyes began to chip away at the perfection I thought my family had. I didn't want to see the truth, but the truth found me. One evening, curiosity led me to overhear a conversation I wish I could have heard. My father's voice carried a weight I had never heard before, confessing something that shattered the world I lived in. He had been unfaithful to my mother, and in that instant, the man I had adored turned into a stranger. The discovery filled me with emotions too big for my young heart to process. Anger boiled inside me, mixed with sadness so deep that it felt like my chest would cave in. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he would throw away the love we had for someone else. But instead, I froze, unable to face him, because facing him meant acknowledging that my safe place was gone. I remember the way my mother cried that night, her body shaking as if the ground had collapsed beneath her. Her pain became my pain, and I could no longer see my father as the man who once held my hand so tightly. The days that followed were heavy with silence. My father tried to act normal, as though nothing had changed, but everything had changed. The warmth in our home turned cold, replaced by an invisible wall between him and the rest of us. I stopped talking to him unless absolutely necessary, and even then my words were sharp, short, filled with a bitterness I didn't know a daughter could feel for her father. Each glance at him reminded me of betrayal, and I couldn't reconcile the man who read me bedtime stories with the man who broke my mother's heart. I withdrew into myself, carrying the weight of disappointment. My friends still saw me as the girl with a perfect family, but inside I knew that picture had burned to ashes. I envied children who could laugh with their fathers without hesitation, while I sat in the same room with mine feeling like there was an unbridgeable canyon between us. It wasn't just about what he did to my mother, it was about what he took from me. He took away my trust, my sense of security, and the certainty that he would always protect me. That betrayal built a wall I didn't want to tear down. Instead, I chose distance. I stopped seeking his approval, stopped waiting for his praise, and stopped believing he could ever be the man I once thought he was. My childhood ended the night I discovered his betrayal, and with it ended the father-daughter bond one had cherished so deeply. From that moment on, I told myself that forgiveness was impossible, and that some wounds could never be healed. Word count, ~574. Do you want me to continue with section 2 in the same style and quality? The years that followed felt like living in the shadow of something I couldn't escape. My father and I lived under the same roof for a while, but it was as if we were strangers forced to share the same air. We didn't argue much, but that silence was heavier than any fight could have been. I avoided him at the dinner table, avoided looking into his eyes, and avoided anything that reminded me of the man who had once been my safe place. Every time he tried to speak, I found myself shutting down, because in my mind his words could never carry honesty again. As I entered my teenage years, the distance between us became the story of my life. Friends talked about their fathers dropping them off at school, attending their performances, and offering advice about crushes and exams. I nodded politely, but inside I ached. I missed him even while resenting him, and that contradiction tore at me. I longed for the father who used to cheer for me from the sidelines, but I couldn't forget that he had chosen someone else over our family. My love for him was still there, buried under layers of hurt, but the anger made it impossible for me to reach for it. He made efforts, I can't deny that. There were small notes left for me before school, occasional calls when he was away, little gestures meant to remind me he cared. But I ignored most of them. When he asked about my day, I answered in one word. When he showed up at my school event, I avoided eye contact. Every attempt he made to bridge the gap only reminded me of how deep the gap was. It was as if he was standing on one side of a broken bridge, waving, while I stood frozen on the other, unwilling to take even a single step forward. I could see his regret in the way he carried himself. His shoulders weren't as straight, his laughter didn't come as easily, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he looked at me with eyes full of sorrow. Maybe he wanted to explain himself, maybe he wanted me to understand, but I wasn't ready. I told myself he had made his choice, and now I was making mine, to live without the father I once trusted. My mother never pressured me to forgive him either. She had her own wounds to heal, and I knew my loyalty was to her. Years passed like this, filled with a silence that became routine. Birthdays came and went, but the candles never brought back what we had lost. Holidays were gatherings where we were polite but never close. I grew older, more independent, and part of me believed that I no longer needed him. Yet every now and then, when life felt overwhelming, I caught myself wishing I still had a father to lean on. That thought scared me, because it meant I hadn't truly let go, even though I pretended I had. By the time I became an adult, I had convinced myself that the relationship was beyond repair. Too much time had passed, too many moments were lost, and too many words were left unsaid. The idea of reconciliation seemed naive, like hoping for a broken mirror to reflect clearly again. So I locked that part of my heart away, telling myself it was better to live with emptiness than to risk being hurt again. I believed then, with all my certainty, that our story had already ended. Word count, ~573. Do you want me to move on and write section 3 in the same flow? It happened at a time I least expected. Life had moved me far from the quiet wounds of childhood, and I was focused on building my own path. I had learned to survive without leaning on him, convincing myself that he was just another figure from my past, someone who no longer belonged in the present. But fate has a strange way of testing the walls we build. The first real shift came when I stood on the edge of an important milestone in my life, one that should have been filled with celebration and pride. Out of nowhere, he reached out. His voice on the phone was hesitant, almost trembling, as if he was afraid I would hang up before he could finish his sentence. I didn't know what to say. My instinct was to reject him, to guard myself the way I always had. But something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't the voice of the man I remembered, full of authority and confidence. It was softer, almost broken, like a person who had been carrying the weight of regret for far too long. Against my own will, I agreed to meet him, though my heart pounded with suspicion and unease. When I saw him again, the years had left their mark. He looked older, his face lined with tiredness, and his eyes carried a heaviness that words couldn't describe. He didn't try to hug me or pretend that everything was fine. Instead, he simply sat across from me, hands folded, and for the first time since I had discovered his betrayal, I felt like he was showing me who he truly was: flawed, human, and deeply remorseful. He began to speak, not with excuses but with honesty. He admitted his mistakes, admitted the selfishness of the choices he had made, and admitted the pain he had caused both my mother and me. His voice cracked more than once, and I could see him struggle to hold back tears. He didn't ask me to forgive him right away. He didn't pretend that a conversation could erase the past. Instead, he told me that he hoped, even after everything, I could one day see him not as the man who failed us, but as the father who still loved me with all his heart. I sat there frozen, torn between anger and an unexpected surge of compassion. Part of me wanted to hold on to the bitterness I had carried for so long, because that bitterness had become my armor. But another part, quieter yet persistent, whispered that maybe this was the moment I had secretly wished for, the moment when he would finally acknowledge the pain he caused instead of hiding behind silence. He didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, he showed up in ways I had stopped expecting. He called not to demand but to listen. He wrote me a long letter, filled with memories of when I was little, and confessions of how much he regretted losing those years with me. He even offered his help with something important in my life, not to earn forgiveness, but simply to prove that he still wanted to be there. It wasn't easy for me. Every gesture from him reopened wounds I thought I had buried. But with each attempt, I saw a side of him I hadn't seen in years: humility, patience, and a willingness to rebuild without rushing me. For the first time, the wall I had built didn't feel unshakable. I wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but I was no longer certain that I never would. Word count, ~577. Would you like me to continue with the final section for now, carrying it into full reconciliation and closure. The change didn't happen all at once. It was slow, uneven, filled with hesitation, but it was real. After that first reunion, I allowed small cracks in the wall I had built. At first, it was just short conversations, polite, careful, without any real weight. But slowly, I noticed myself answering his calls instead of ignoring them. We began talking more often, sometimes about simple things like work or the weather, other times about heavier topics we had avoided for years. It felt awkward, like learning how to walk again after forgetting the steps, but there was something undeniable in his persistence. He wasn't forcing his way back in. He was quietly waiting for me to let him. As weeks turned into months, I started to see glimpses of the man I once adored. He encouraged me when I felt uncertain about my choices, offering guidance not with authority but with gentleness. He showed up when I needed help, without asking for recognition. His consistency began to melt away my defenses, proving that this wasn't just a temporary display of guilt, it was a true desire to rebuild what had been broken. For the first time in years, I laughed in his presence. It was a small moment, but that laughter felt like a piece of my childhood returning. The turning point came during a heartfelt conversation I didn't expect to have. I had carried my anger for so long that it had become part of who I was, but on that day I found myself unable to hold it in any longer. I told him everything, the pain of discovering his betrayal, the nights I cried myself to sleep, the loneliness of growing up without the father I wanted by my side. My words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and for once, he didn't try to defend himself. He just listened. Tears ran down his face as he apologized again and again, not with grand promises but with sincerity that left no room for doubt. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it had never happened. It was about freeing myself from the weight of anger I had carried for too long. So, with tears in my eyes, I told him I forgave him. Not because what he did was acceptable, but because I wanted to believe in the possibility of love stronger than mistakes. He broke down then, holding my hands as though they were the most precious thing he had ever been given, and for the first time in years, I didn't pull away. From that day forward, our relationship began to feel whole again, not perfect, not flawless, but real. We created new memories, ones that weren't overshadowed by betrayal. He celebrated my achievements, stood beside me in my struggles, and reminded me through his actions that he was willing to be the father I deserved. There were still moments of pain, memories that would always sting, but they no longer controlled me. Instead, they became a reminder of how far we had come. Looking back now, I see that our story isn't about a perfect father or an unbreakable bond. It's about two people choosing to rebuild despite the cracks, choosing to love despite the scars. My father's betrayal changed my childhood, but his efforts to rebuild gave me back something even more powerful, the knowledge that love, when nurtured with honesty and humility, can heal even the deepest wounds. And though our relationship will never erase the past, it has become a testament to the strength of forgiveness and the beauty of second chances. Word count, ~579. Now you have the full 2,000+ word script, sections 1 to 4, ready for narration. Would you like me to also suggest background visuals and music mood for your faceless video so it flows with maximum emotional impact?